Okay, so we've just covered our opening activity, our opening kingism rather. Last time we spoke, we were talking about the mistreatment of Native Americans by the Spanish. We talked about the torture, death, slaughter, disease, and what was the story that was being told about the Spanish? What was the name of that story called, where the Spanish brought only death and destruction? What did we call that story? The Black Legend. So we talked about that Black Legend already. I want you to be familiar with what happened there. That's kind of just a recap of what we ended with last time. Today what we're going to talk about is some of maybe the benefits of this interaction between the Spanish and the Native Americans. Yes, the vast majority of Native Americans could argue that, this interaction was bad, but there were some benefits overall for, the entire world. So what I want to talk about today is the Columbian Exchange. So we're going to talk about the Columbian Exchange today, so go ahead and write that down in your notes. We're calling this the Columbian Exchange. Yes, sir. You're just continuing your notes. So you'll have notes, and then in the middle of your notes, you'll have opening activities, and you'll also have notes all the way through. Okay, so today we're talking about the Columbian Exchange first. The Columbian Exchange. And what the Columbian Exchange was the exchange of goods between the Old World and the New World. So the Columbian Exchange was an exchange of goods from the Old World to the New World and back. So again, the Columbian Exchange was the exchange of goods between the Old World and the New World. The reason why we say this is that up until 1492, when Columbus came to America, there were things that North America had that Europe never had. And the same, that Europe had things that North America never had until Columbus brought them over and began switching with these goods. And there will be things that we'll mention today that might shock you, that Europe or the Americas never had them until Columbus brought them over. So what we're going to do first is I want you guys to jot down this chart in your notes. Okay, so go ahead and create a 3-column chart in your notes. It won't take up that much space, but let's start off with the first 2 rows. Let's write down this chart in your notes. So the Old World versus the New World. Now, when talking about the exchange of these goods, again, the New World, North America, sent tons of goods over to Europe. Pumpkin, squash, peanuts, tomatoes, corn. And Europe sent stuff all the way to North America as well. Onions, citrus fruits, olives, whatever else. But what this chart is going to do is narrow down some of those things so you don't have to write everything down. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is, what did the New World give to the Old World that was beneficial? What did the Old World get from the New World that proved to be the most beneficial? And the thing that the Old World got that proved to be the most beneficial from the New World were things like potatoes, corn, squash. Those types of goods. This proved to be the most important thing they got from the New World. Now, let me explain why this is important. Before potatoes got to Europe, what do you think a European family did to feed their family? Rather, what did they eat mostly in Europe before they got potatoes? What do you think?
Cabbage, fish.
Not cabbage, not necessarily fish. Think bigger. Like cattle, right? Pigs, sheep, chicken. Make sense so far? Now, let's say you're going to start off with a family, and your new family is going to start off with this baby cow, the calf. So, at what point do you get to eat that baby cow? Right now? No. Does that cow have to grow up first? How long might that take to get this cow big enough for you to milk it, eat it eventually? A couple years? Sure. So in those couple years, are you feeding that cow? Sure. And in those couple years, are you eating? No. So here you are spending all this time feeding an animal, and yet you and your family are starving. Is that an efficient way to feed your family? Not really. But with potatoes, you guys know how easy it is to grow a potato? You take a potato seed, I don't even know potatoes come in seeds, but you have potato in the ground, and then you walk away, and then boom, potatoes. It's very easy. Just add water and potatoes. Now, the other thing about potatoes is this. One, they're easy to grow, right? Very easy to grow. And two, when you put a potato type seed in the ground, and when it grows, do you get one potato? You get lots of potatoes. Now, here's the thing about potatoes also. When you think about potatoes and people are on diets, do people like eating potatoes when they're on a diet, like French fries? Why not? What do they complain like, oh, but I can't eat French fries because potatoes have a lot of calories. Now, we don't like that if we're dieting, but if you're, let's put it this way, who does like potatoes? Who does like things with lots of calories? Yeah, Jessica? Huh? Yeah. Oh, you guys. Okay, I see what you're doing. You do like potatoes. I meant that more of a which groups of people like potatoes, but yes, I guess you also do like potatoes. What I meant was, who would like potatoes, or who would like high-calorie goods like potatoes? Oh yeah, people that are starving. They would love potatoes because is that an easy way to feed your family? And if all of a sudden you didn't need one cow that would take 3 or 4 years to grow, but you could feed your family on like 2 potatoes per meal, is that going to be beneficial to you? And if potatoes are easy to grow, might you be able to have a few more kids? And so what impact might this Columbian Exchange of potatoes have on Europe? An increased population. So let's put it this way, folks. This benefit was in high-calorie goods or high-calorie foods that resulted in what again? A population increase. So you guys may not even consider this until you've heard it today, but yeah, the introduction of potatoes could increase the population of an entire continent. Just think about that. And it's weird because when you think of Europeans, you assume they always had potatoes, right? Like the Irish always eat potatoes, they must have always had potatoes. But no, not until 1492. 1493 even. So that's kind of a shocking statement to make. But yeah, was this a big benefit for Europeans? The population can now grow, they can colonize more. Big benefit from this exchange that they got from the New World. Let's talk about what the New World got from the Europeans. So who can take a guess and think what the best thing was that Native Americans got from the Europeans? Not coffee. Animals, yes, but more importantly, what? The horse. You guys may not realize this, and this might be hard to fathom, but until Columbus came to America, Native Americans did not have horses. There were no horses in America before Columbus brought them over. Now, how many of you that comes as a shock? Like, how do you mean there's no, I mean, like, when you think of Native American, you think horses, right? Which goes to show how important did horses become to Native American culture. Very. They adopted it very quickly. Because how might you benefit from a horse? If you're a Native American civilization, how might a horse benefit your new society? Eileen? Yeah, transportation and travel. How else might your society benefit? Grisella?
To put things to carry on the horses.
Yeah, so like transportation of goods. How else might your society benefit? Mark? Warfare, if you're fighting battles. Anything else, Denise?
You can carry goods faster.
Yeah, definitely trading would be better. Would communication be faster? And also, what can you use these animals for, Carlos?
Milk.
Horses?
Have you tried horse milk?
You don't typically drink horse milk. They're not bred for that, but you could, but you don't. I mean, you could drink rat's milk too, I guess. But Fabian?
Agriculture?
Agriculture. I mean, you could use a horse to plow fields, whatever else, right? So, do you think a horse was pretty critical in the development of Native American civilizations after 1492? Most definitely. But again, shocking, right? Well, I always thought they had horses. No. Can you imagine 2 entire continents never having horses until we brought them over? They came on boats. Anyway, so that's the benefits. Let's talk about costs. So what did we lose in this exchange? What was the worst thing that we received? Well, if you were a European, gentlemen, the worst thing that they received, if you're European, was syphilis. Oh, one more thing. Benefits, gold and silver. Of course, that's a pretty obvious one. But in terms of costs, syphilis. Who can raise their hand and tell me what syphilis is? Carlos.
Sexually transmitted.
It is a sexually transmitted disease. Now, how many of you have heard of people dying of syphilis? You probably should have, because it's not very common. Very, very rare to die of syphilis. Because syphilis is what? Treatable. You can treat syphilis. So it's kind of annoying. It could be a problem, but can you survive it? Sure you can. And so bad, not ideal, but again, you can survive syphilis. But that's the worst thing that the Europeans got. What about the Native Americans? What's the worst thing that they got in this exchange? Raphael? Smallpox. Measles. Malaria. The flu. I mean, yes, syphilis might be annoying, and if left untreated, might you die from it? Sure, just like any other disease. But smallpox, what's the possibility of you dying if you contract smallpox? Very, very high. I mean, I think it's like more than 50% you're going to die if you get smallpox, which is not good, by the way. If you want to flip a coin and the coin says, I'm always usually going to go to one side or another, you don't want to use that coin. But in any case, smallpox, measles, malaria, and flu, that's what the Native Americans got from Europe. So in your assessment, in the long term, who benefited more from this exchange of goods? The European or Old World, right? Because that population growth is pretty substantial. I mean, that really will change the course of history. Who might have benefited in the short term? That could be a little bit more debatable, right? You could say, well, the horses were pretty sweet, as was the gold and silver going to Europe. So that one you can debate a little bit more. Here's one that I don't think could be debatable, but you might surprise me. Who suffered the most from the Columbian Exchange? The New World, right? Definitely Native Americans. So again, what we're talking about here again is that were there some benefits to this interaction? Definitely, but there are also definitely a lot of costs. So this is known as the Columbian Exchange. I like to call it the hemispheric swap of ecosystems. That's a more fancy way of calling it if you want to be cool in your essays. The hemispheric swap of ecosystems. To be fancy. You don't have to be. Anyway, here's the next question you should write down and then answer. So we got to America, the Europeans. So here's my question. How did hundreds of Europeans defeat millions of natives? How did hundreds of Europeans defeat millions of natives? So again, how did hundreds of Europeans defeat millions of natives? Because it's not like the Europeans were sending like boat after boat after boat after boat. At most, their ships were, had like 100, 300 people on it. But they defeated a population of over 160 million. How did they do that? Well, I'll guide you through this answer, though many of you may already know. The first answer that many of you might jump to immediately is what? Better weapons. Better weapons. So better weapons is the first answer. Better weapons. If you think about it, folks, what type of weapons do the Europeans have? Iron swords, metal swords, and armor, right? They have metal swords and armor. Compare that to what the natives have. I mean, Europeans have metal swords and armor. What do the natives have? Wood, rocks, maybe wood axes, rock axes. And what's their armor made out of? Animal furs, maybe some wood or whatever else. So let's fight real quick. Let's imagine this. I take my metal sword and I stab you and you're wearing Native American armor. Who wins? The European wins, right? Now, let's switch that around. Let's say I'm wearing metal armor. Helmet, chest, everything else. And you hit me with a wooden club. Who wins? The European also wins. So in that respect, were Europeans better equipped? Sure, metal armor, metal weapons. In addition, what other weapon have we yet to mention? Not yet. We'll get to that. Guns and cannons. Guns and cannons were also a technological advantage. But here's the problem, though. Guns and cannons are not very accurate, okay? Because back then, did we have factories? No. So who's making guns and bullets? Just people. Like, you might make a bullet, you might make a bullet. Are they all going to shoot the same way? So no, these guns were not very accurate, but they did have an impact. And I want to explain this. So go ahead and close your eyes real quick. Imagine that you're a Native American, and you're ready to declare war on the Europeans, and so you're walking towards their ship, and you know that war is on. So they point this metal stick at you, and you think, well, what's that going to do? I mean, they're so far away, and all of a sudden, BAM! And then 10 people are dead. Giant hole in the ground. Your friends have all gone missing. And you look around, you wonder, well, how was that possible? I don't see bows and arrows. And so all of a sudden you believe that these Europeans have the power of God in their hands. So it's not like the guns had to be accurate. All the guns had to be was terrifying. And so these shotguns and cannons, they had a psychological impact. The psychological impact of guns and cannons was pretty important. I mean, the noise was terrifying, and the fact that your friends are falling over, there's holes in their bodies, and you see no bows and arrows, you think, what sorcery is this? How have these men fallen without what I understand to be weapons? It's shocking. I mean, if you guys ever see lasers in the future, I imagine you'd be like, what is this? Like, we would also be shocked in the future if that existed. And so it was similar to the natives. Everyone so far with weapons? Next up, horses. Had natives seen horses up until this point? No. So when these men came riding in on horses, it had a psychological impact. I mean, imagine if you're a Native American for the first time, you see this man riding a horse, and you look at that and you wonder, what would you call that? Is that a man with 4 legs? I don't know what I'm looking at. When natives first saw men on horse, cavalry of sorts, they believed that the man and the horse were one and the same. They were centaurs of sorts, because if you've never seen it before, I mean, wouldn't that be a natural assumption? Right? Like, you assume they're the same thing. So Native Americans were shocked by what they saw. I mean, they thought, these men have brought monsters with them, and the power of God's in their hand. Is that going to be psychologically impactful? Most definitely. Also, the mere fact that these men rode on horses on cavalry versus people on the ground. Who wins? Cavalry. Cavalry is someone on a horse, right? If you're charging into battle on a horse, you are part of the cavalry. And a guy riding on a horse swinging a sword is better than a guy on the ground. Okay, you have the advantage. But lastly, of course, what's the most obvious answer? Why were hundreds able to defeat millions? Disease. I mean, imagine if you came on to Tenochtitlan way back when, the great Aztec city, you thought, oh my God, there's millions of them. Cortez, what should we do? Don't worry, I have a plan. Yes, we're going to battle with you next week. I just want to say hello. It's a formal custom to just say hello and greet each other. I'll see you next week. And then when you come back, they're all dead of disease. Easy. So really what it came down to was that disease played a huge role in defeating the Native Americans at that time. The last thing we're going to talk about today is the Spanish colonial structure. And the first thing I want to mention is the politics, or the political structure of the Spanish social colonies, or Spanish colonies rather. First off, politically, or the politics of the colonies, there was no democracy. And so if there was no democracy, what that meant was that the colonies were directly controlled by the king. These colonies were directly controlled by the king, and because they were controlled directly by the king, that didn't necessarily mean that the king would show up, because he was all the way in Spain. Instead, the way he would directly control the colonies was through someone known as a viceroy. And the viceroy would govern the colonies on behalf of the king. He was a type of governor that reported directly to the Spanish crown. And because of that, like I said previously, there was no democracy in the colonies at this time. After politics, we also want to discuss the economic structure of the Spanish colonies. So economically, the colonies were also directly controlled by the king, which is not surprising since the king already directly controlled their politics. The basic idea suggesting that all exports of gold, silver, sugar, and all other goods had to go to Spain directly, even if France or England could buy it at a higher price. All of this was sold to Spain. And the reason why this was the case was because of an economic philosophy at the time known as mercantilism. And mercantilism suggested that all the efforts of the colonies must benefit the mother country. All the efforts of the colonies must benefit the mother country. The idea was that the colonies served to provide the mother country with natural resources and markets, and the idea was that everything that we did was to benefit the king, the government, the queen, the mother country in general. So that if you were a colonist coming to the Americas, you didn't try to make yourself a rich man. We didn't send you to America to become wealthy and rich for yourself. The reason why we sent you was to, grow food, find slaves, find gold so that the mother country could benefit. Now, if you did a good job, then you might be rewarded with more land and slaves and estate and showered with titles and nobility and land and whatever else. But the goal of colonization was to benefit the mother country. And the reason why was because there was a theory that countries were competing for scarce resources. They were competing for scarce or limited natural resources around the world. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about if England had taken over and got to the Americas before Spain did, England obviously would not have been willing to trade or give Spain any of its gold or silver. So the idea behind mercantilism is that, again, there's a competition between countries for scarce resources, and the colonies have to get there first in order to benefit their respective mother country. So that's the economics of why they had a very strict and directly controlled system. And not to mention the fact that they also had encomienda. Let's not forget that. The idea that their Native Americans were forced to be Christianized and be slaves when that land was given to Spanish landowners. Yep. You're welcome. Lastly, there's Spanish society. Now, the Spanish society was divided up into 5 really basic groups. The first were the peninsulares. Now, the peninsulares were Spanish people born in Spain. These were the Spanish born in Spain. They were obviously considered the highest class because, they grew up in Spain, they had that Spanish culture. And so typically these people governed the colonies. They had a lot of influence over the king, and the viceroy would typically come from the peninsulares class. They would come from the peninsulares class, and they were the top of the class because, again, of their direct connection with Spain. Below the peninsulares were the Creoles, and you can guess that these were Spanish born in the Americas. Now, again, they are Spanish blood, so again, they do still have a lot of Spanish power, I guess you could say, and Spanish property and Spanish influence, but they're not as influential as the peninsulares. In fact, many peninsulares believe that the Creoles were not real Spanish because they didn't go to Spanish institutions or they didn't go to Spanish schools. Nonetheless, these Creoles, these Spanish-born America, they were oftentimes the encomienderos or the hacienderos. They were the ones who owned the land. They were the landowners, the farm owners. They were the ones who owned the slaves, Native American slaves, and so they did do most of the work. This was also the group that often intermarried with the local natives because there were very few women. So you can imagine what impact that had on the colonies at the time. Because we're talking about intermarriage, the next class level then would be the mestizos. And the mestizos were obviously mixed blood. They were mixed Spanish and Native American. Because of their mixed blood, the darker they were, or the more Native American they looked, they were likely to be slaves. But if they were more European looking, they might be able to pass off and have a better lot in life. Many of them became ranchers or miners or merchants. Some of them became translators. Some of them guided the Native American slaves on their farms. So again, they had better lives. I mean, you could describe it as being the middle class, But again, they were second-class citizens at best because they weren't pure-blooded Spanish. Below them, of course, were natives who were often slaves. And below that group were African slaves who eventually replaced the natives after disease, and mulattoes who were half African and half Spanish or half Native American. The one thing I want you to take a look at with this Spanish social structure is that in this structure, there was what we like to call no social mobility. No social mobility. And what that means is that could you change class if you're from a Spanish colony? And the answer is no, because if you look, each of these classes are based on race or, where you were born. So if you were born a native, you couldn't, hope and grow up one day be a Creole because you were born into your status. You could not change it. You were unable to change your social class in Spanish colonies. So unfortunately, because of this social structure based on race, there was no social mobility. This is different from America because in America, you have a social structure based on wealth. So regardless of where you're born, a poor person can grow up to become rich and a rich person can grow up to become poor, and it's not already dependent based on your birth. You can actually change your status in life. This is again different from what was happening in the Spanish colonies. Therefore, you say there was no social mobility. The last things I want to point out is that there was little or no social diversity. There was little or no social diversity. Because if you think about it, in terms of ethnic demographics, the only types of person in the Spanish colonies at the time were the Spanish, the Native Americans, and the Africans. That's it. They didn't encourage the British or the French to come into their colonies because of mercantilism. There isn't very much ethnic diversity. There's also no religious diversity because everyone is Catholic. So if you look at it, there's very little social diversity. So that's it for the Spanish colonies. Okay, thanks a lot. Next time, we're going to go ahead and talk about the English colonies in North America.